The moment you believe no one understands you, is often the moment you reveal who you really are. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished silver as conversations drifted through the private dining room of the Grand Lexington in downtown Chicago. It was just after 7 in the evening. Outside, rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Inside, wealth spoke in quiet voices. At the center table sat Richard Holloway, 58 years old, founder of Holloway Capital, a man whose name appeared on financial news channels almost every week. His charcoal suit looked custom-tailored. His Swiss watch reflected the warm amber light. Around him sat executives, investors, and one important guest from the Middle East whose signature could finalize a $3 billion partnership by midnight. Richard smiled as the server approached with a fresh pot of coffee. Claire Whitmore moved calmly between tables, her black uniform pressed neatly, her blonde hair resting just above her shoulders. At 41, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Not the confidence of someone trying to be noticed, but the confidence of someone who no longer needed to be. Richard barely looked at her. To him, she was simply another waitress. Another face in the background. Another person serving coffee while important people discussed important things. As Claire poured the coffee, the billionaire leaned slightly toward one of his associates and spoke in Arabic. His tone was casual. Amused. Certain no one nearby would understand. The men at his table chuckled. Richard smirked. In his mind, the comment was harmless. Just a private joke. A reminder that power belonged to those who knew more than everyone else. Claire continued pouring. For a moment, her expression didn't change. Then she slowly lifted her eyes. Calm. Steady. Almost unreadable. Richard reached for his cup. The conversation continued. No one noticed the subtle shift in the room. No one except Claire. She placed the coffee pot back onto the silver tray. Then, in flawless Arabic, she answered him. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just enough for the entire table to hear. The words floated through the room like a sudden change in temperature. Richard's hand stopped halfway to his lips. The smile disappeared. Across the table, the international guest blinked in surprise. One executive nearly dropped his pen. Silence arrived so quickly it felt physical. Claire's pronunciation was perfect. Her rhythm natural. Her accent effortless. She hadn't simply memorized a phrase. She spoke like someone who had lived inside the language. Richard stared at her. For the first time that evening, he truly looked at her. The waitress stood calmly beside the table, her blue-gray eyes meeting his without fear. Without apology. Without challenge. The billionaire who always had something to say suddenly had nothing at all. And as the silence stretched across the room, one question echoed through his mind. Who exactly was this woman? No one spoke for several seconds. The investors looked at Claire. The guest from Dubai looked at Claire. Even the restaurant manager standing near the bar looked at Claire. Yet she seemed completely unaffected by the attention. She simply gave a polite nod, lifted the coffee pot, and continued her work as if nothing unusual had happened. That might have been the most surprising part of all. Richard Holloway had spent 3 decades around powerful people. Whenever someone impressed a room, they usually enjoyed the spotlight. Claire appeared eager to escape it. She moved to the next table, refilled 2 cups, offered a warm smile to an elderly couple, and disappeared toward the kitchen doors. The conversation at Richard's table struggled to recover. The Middle Eastern executive finally broke the silence. Your waitress speaks excellent Arabic. Richard forced a small laugh. Apparently she does. But the answer sounded weak even to him. Because the question now was not how she spoke it. The question was why. As the negotiations resumed, Richard found himself distracted. Numbers were discussed. Projections appeared on tablets. Attorneys reviewed contract language. Yet every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the dining room. Claire remained calm. Professional. Invisible again. It irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Most people reacted when they impressed someone like Richard Holloway. Most people hoped to be noticed. Claire seemed determined not to care. Nearly 40 minutes later, the meeting paused for dessert and coffee. The rain outside had become heavier. Water streamed down the glass windows overlooking the city. Richard stood and adjusted his jacket. "Excuse me for a moment," he said. He crossed the restaurant floor with deliberate confidence. Employees quickly stepped aside. People always stepped aside. But when he reached the service station near the kitchen, Claire did not appear nervous. She was organizing receipts beside a small espresso machine. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up. "Mr. Holloway." Her voice remained calm. "You surprised everyone back there. I apologize if I interrupted your meeting. You did not answer my question." A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. "You did not ask one yet." For a moment Richard found himself oddly unprepared. That rarely happened. He was used to controlling conversations from the first sentence. Claire had a way of quietly shifting the balance without raising her voice. "Where did you learn Arabic?" he finally asked. Her fingers paused on a stack of receipts. "A long time ago." "That is not really an answer. It is the only one I am giving tonight." Richard studied her face. There was no hostility there. No arrogance. Just a boundary. Firm and immovable. Somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, plates clinked softly. A server hurried past carrying desserts. Life continued around them. Yet Richard could not shake the feeling that he was standing in front of a mystery far more valuable than the contract waiting on his table. Claire glanced toward the dining room. "Your guests are waiting." Richard followed her gaze. The executive from Dubai was already looking in their direction. "This conversation is not over," Richard said quietly. Claire picked up the coffee pot again. "Most interesting conversations never are." Then she walked away, leaving the billionaire standing alone beside the espresso machine, watching a waitress who somehow knew exactly how to leave powerful people wanting answers. Back at the table, the negotiations resumed, but something had shifted. The room still carried the elegance of a multi-million-dollar deal in progress. Crystal glasses reflected the city lights. Coffee steamed gently beside leather portfolios. Rain continued to slide down the windows overlooking Chicago. Yet Richard Holloway could not focus the way he normally did. Across from him, Omar Al-Masri, the visiting executive from Dubai, reviewed a stack of documents with growing concern. His expression tightened. He exchanged a few quiet remarks with his legal advisor in Arabic. Then another. The energy around the table changed almost immediately. Richard noticed it. So did everyone else. The attorneys stopped taking notes. The investors exchanged uncertain glances. Something was wrong. "Is there a problem?" Richard asked. Omar looked up slowly. "There appears to be a discrepancy in the translated draft." Richard frowned. "What kind of discrepancy?" Omar tapped a paragraph with his finger. "This section changes the timeline for infrastructure commitments. The Arabic version and the English version do not match." Silence settled over the table. Richard immediately turned toward the translator hired for the evening. The young man adjusted his glasses nervously and began reviewing the documents. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. The translator's confidence seemed to disappear page by page. I may need to double-check several sections." Richard felt a knot forming in his stomach. Months of preparation. Hundreds of hours of negotiations. A partnership worth $3 billion. All of it suddenly balanced on a few paragraphs nobody had questioned before tonight. Omar closed the folder. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Somehow that made it worse. In my experience, he said calmly, translation errors usually reveal larger communication problems. Richard understood exactly what that meant. Trust was beginning to erode. Around them, the restaurant continued operating normally. Waiters moved between tables. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. But at the center table, the atmosphere felt completely different. Heavy. Fragile. Richard searched for a solution. None appeared. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed Claire crossing the dining room carrying a tray of coffee cups. She was not paying attention to the meeting. At least it seemed that way. She simply moved with the same quiet professionalism she had displayed all evening. Yet Richard found himself watching her. Remembering the flawless Arabic. Remembering the confidence in her voice. Remembering the way Omar himself had reacted with surprise and respect. For the first time in years, Richard considered doing something he normally avoided. Asking for help from someone outside the room. Claire passed their table. Omar glanced up and recognized her immediately. A faint smile appeared on his face. Richard noticed. The translator noticed. Everyone noticed. And suddenly one impossible thought entered the billionaire's mind. The waitress might be the only person in the building capable of saving the conversation before it collapsed completely. Richard rarely hesitated before making a decision. That instinct had built companies, closed acquisitions, and helped him navigate markets that changed by the hour. Yet now he found himself staring at a waitress carrying a silver tray through a crowded dining room, wondering whether she was the answer to a problem that should never have existed in the first place. Claire set 2 coffee cups onto a nearby table and turned to leave. "Miss Whitmore," Richard called. She stopped. Slowly. Several heads turned in her direction. Claire walked back toward the table with the same calm expression she always seemed to wear. Not nervous. Not eager. Simply present. "Is something wrong with the coffee?" she asked. Richard almost smiled. Even now, she was pretending this was a normal conversation. Omar Al-Masri closed the disputed contract and looked at Claire with obvious curiosity. "Actually," Richard said, choosing his words carefully, "we have a translation issue." Claire glanced at the documents. "I see. The Arabic and English versions do not appear to match." For a brief moment, her eyes settled on the open page. Then she looked back up. "And you would like me to take a look?" Richard noticed something unusual. She did not sound flattered. She did not sound intimidated. She sounded like a professional evaluating whether she wanted the assignment. The realization made him strangely uncomfortable. "If you are willing," he said. Claire remained silent for several seconds. The room seemed to wait with her. Finally, she placed the tray on an empty chair. "I have 10 minutes before my next section needs attention." Omar smiled. 10 minutes may be enough." Claire sat carefully at the edge of the table and pulled the contract closer. The translator shifted uncomfortably beside her. Richard noticed. Claire noticed too. Yet she said nothing. She simply began reading. The restaurant noise faded into the background. Her eyes moved steadily across the paragraphs. English. Arabic. English again. Occasionally she turned a page. Occasionally she made a small note with a pen borrowed from one of the attorneys. Nobody interrupted her. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. Then 10. Finally Claire exhaled softly and closed the folder. The silence felt heavier than before. Richard leaned forward. "Well?" Claire folded her hands. "The issue is not a single mistake." The translator visibly paled. Claire continued calmly. There are 14 translation inconsistencies throughout the document. Several investors exchanged stunned looks. 14. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Claire pointed to the first page. Most are subtle. A deadline becomes a recommendation. A guarantee becomes an expectation. A commitment becomes a possibility. She turned another page. Individually they appear minor. Together they completely change the meaning of the agreement. Nobody spoke. Even the jazz music seemed distant now. Omar looked at Claire with growing respect. Richard looked at the contract. Then at Claire. For the second time that evening, the billionaire found himself speechless. Because the woman everyone had mistaken for part of the background had just revealed a problem that an entire team of highly paid professionals had failed to see. Nobody questioned Claire after that. Not immediately. The evidence was sitting on the table in black and white. 14 inconsistencies. 14 opportunities for misunderstanding. 14 reasons a partnership worth billions could have quietly unraveled. The translator stared at the documents as if seeing them for the first time. Richard noticed the man's hands tighten around his pen. He almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because the truth was impossible to ignore. Claire had discovered in 10 minutes what an entire team had missed over several weeks. Omar slowly reopened the contract and reviewed the notes Claire had marked. The more he read, the more impressed he became. She is correct, he finally said. His voice was calm, but the impact was enormous. Every attorney at the table immediately leaned closer. One by one, they reviewed the passages. One by one, they reached the same conclusion. Claire was right. Richard watched the reactions spread around the room. Confusion. Surprise. Admiration. Then something else. Respect. Real respect. The kind that could not be purchased or negotiated. Claire gathered the papers into a neat stack and gently pushed them back across the table. You should have your legal teams revise both versions before anyone signs. Her tone remained professional. Matter of fact. As if she had merely pointed out a typo on a dinner menu. Richard shook his head slightly. He could not understand how someone with this level of expertise could be carrying coffee instead of leading international negotiations. How did you catch all of that so quickly? He asked. Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows. For a moment she seemed far away. Lost inside a memory nobody else could see. Then she returned to the present. Languages are not just words, she said quietly. They are intentions. If you only translate vocabulary, you miss what people actually mean. The room fell silent again. Even Omar smiled. That is exactly right. Claire glanced at the clock mounted near the service station. My break is over. Richard almost laughed. A $3 billion agreement was hanging in the balance, and she was worried about returning to her section. Yet somehow that made her even more remarkable. She stood from the table. Omar rose as well. Miss Whitmore. Claire paused. Omar placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of sincere appreciation. Thank you. Claire offered a small smile. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just genuine kindness. Then she turned and walked away. The executives watched her cross the dining room. The investors watched her. The attorneys watched her. Richard watched her longest of all. Because the more answers he received, the larger the mystery became. And for the first time in many years, a business deal was no longer the most interesting thing in the room. The revised documents moved quickly after that. Attorneys compared versions line by line. Assistants exchanged notes. Fresh copies were requested. What had looked like a potential disaster only 30 minutes earlier was slowly transforming into a solution. Yet Richard found his attention drifting away from the contract again. Every answer seemed to create a new question. Near the far side of the dining room, Claire was helping a family celebrate a birthday. She smiled as she placed a dessert on the table. The children laughed. The parents thanked her. There was nothing extraordinary about the scene. And yet Richard could not stop watching. Because the woman who had just impressed international executives was acting as though none of it had happened. Around 9 o'clock, the rain finally began to ease. The city lights beyond the windows appeared brighter now, reflecting across the wet streets below. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had softened. The tension that had gripped the negotiation was fading. Omar reviewed the final revisions and nodded approvingly. "Much better," he said. "Now both versions say the same thing." Relief spread around the table. Quiet. Measured. Professional. Richard should have been focused on that victory. Instead, he found himself looking toward the service station once again. "You are curious about her," Omar said suddenly. Richard looked up. "Is it that obvious?" Omar smiled. "Only to everyone." Several investors chuckled softly. Richard rarely became interested in strangers. People usually interested him only when they influenced a deal. Claire was different. She had entered the conversation unexpectedly and somehow become impossible to ignore. "I keep feeling like I should know who she is," Richard admitted. Omar leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps because she carries herself like someone who once belonged in a very different room." The comment lingered in Richard's mind. A very different room. Yes. That was exactly it. Nothing about Claire suggested a person limited by circumstance. Her confidence was too natural. Her knowledge too deep. Her composure too practiced. An hour later, the agreement was finally ready. Signatures were added. Hands were shaken. Smiles returned. What had begun as a difficult evening ended with success. Cameras from the company media team captured photographs for internal announcements. Executives celebrated quietly. Omar approached Claire before leaving. Richard watched from several yards away. The two exchanged a brief conversation in Arabic. Then Omar handed her a business card. Claire accepted it politely. Nothing more. No excitement. No visible reaction. When Omar departed, Richard crossed the room almost immediately. A business card from a man negotiating a $3 billion partnership usually gets people's attention. Claire looked at the card and slipped it into her apron pocket. It was a thoughtful gesture. "That is all?" Richard asked. "That is all." He stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because for perhaps the first time in years, he had met someone completely uninterested in being impressed by power, money, or influence. And somehow, that made her more powerful than anyone else in the room. The restaurant was beginning to empty. Coats were collected. Valet tickets exchanged hands. Conversations drifted toward elevators and waiting cars. Yet Richard remained seated long after most of his guests had left. The signed agreement rested inside a leather portfolio beside him, but his attention was somewhere else entirely. Claire was closing out her section. She moved from table to table, gathering receipts, straightening chairs, wiping polished surfaces until they reflected the warm light overhead. It was nearly 10:30. Most people would have been exhausted after a night like this. Claire looked exactly the same as she had hours earlier. Calm. Focused. Unhurried. Richard finally stood and walked toward the host stand. A young manager greeted him immediately. "Mr. Holloway, was everything satisfactory this evening?" Richard nodded. Then he asked a question that surprised even himself. "How long has Claire worked here?" The manager smiled. "About 6 years." Richard frowned. 6 years. The number felt impossible. Only here. The manager hesitated. As far as I know. Richard thanked him and turned away, but the answer did not satisfy him. Nothing about Claire fit together. The pieces refused to align. A woman who spoke Arabic at a professional level. A woman who could identify legal translation errors in minutes. A woman respected by international executives. And yet she spent her evenings carrying coffee through a dining room. The story made no sense. As Richard prepared to leave, an older gentleman approached from a nearby table. He had remained unusually quiet throughout the evening. Silver hair. Wire-rimmed glasses. A dark navy overcoat folded across his arm. "Excuse me, Mr. Holloway." Richard turned. "Yes." The man glanced toward Claire before lowering his voice. "I could not help overhearing part of the discussion earlier." Richard waited. "The waitress," the man continued. "You seem curious about her." Richard gave a small smile. "You could say that." The man studied Claire for a moment. Then something unexpected crossed his face. Recognition. "I thought it was her." Richard immediately straightened. "You know her?" "Not personally." The man paused. "But I attended an international language conference in Washington about 8 years ago. There was a keynote speaker everyone talked about afterward." Richard listened carefully. "A translation specialist. Brilliant. Fluent in several languages. She presented a report on diplomatic communication failures and how mistranslations can cost governments and corporations billions." Richard felt his pulse quicken. "What was her name?" The older man looked across the dining room one final time. "Claire Whitmore." The words landed with surprising force. Richard stared at him. Speechless. The older man gave a slow nod. "Back then, people said. She had one of the brightest futures in the field." Then he picked up his coat. "I always wondered what happened to her." And for the first time that evening, Richard realized the mystery surrounding Claire was much larger than he had imagined. Richard did not leave immediately. The older gentleman's words echoed through his mind long after the man disappeared into the elevator. One of the brightest futures in the field. The phrase refused to let go. Across the dining room, Claire continued working as though none of it mattered. As though conference stages, international recognition, and extraordinary talent belonged to someone else entirely. Near 11 o'clock, the last guests finally departed. The restaurant grew quieter. Chairs were stacked. Lights dimmed slightly. The city beyond the windows glowed against the damp streets below. Claire carried a tray of empty cups toward the kitchen when Richard stepped into her path. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Simply determined. Claire stopped. "Still here?" she asked. Richard smiled faintly. "Apparently." For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with curiosity. Now it carried something closer to understanding. "I met someone tonight," Richard finally said. Claire waited. "He attended a language conference years ago." Her expression did not change. "Did he?" He remembered the keynote speaker. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Just briefly. But Richard noticed. That was a long time ago. So it was true. Claire set the tray down on a nearby counter. The restaurant around them seemed to fade into the background. "What exactly are you trying to understand, Mr. Holloway?" Richard considered the question carefully. Then he gave the only honest answer. "Why someone with your abilities is working here." Claire looked toward the dark windows overlooking the city. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she spoke quietly. "Life does not always move in straight lines." Richard listened. 8 years ago my younger brother became seriously ill. The treatments were expensive. Insurance covered some of it. Not all of it. Her voice remained steady. Calm. Yet every word carried weight. I accepted fewer contracts. Then fewer still. Eventually I stopped traveling completely. Richard felt something shift inside him. The pieces were finally beginning to connect. And your career? Claire smiled softly. Not with regret. Not with bitterness. Something gentler than either. Some things are worth more than careers. Richard had negotiated billion-dollar deals. Built companies. Acquired competitors. Yet standing there beside a stack of coffee cups, he realized he had no response worthy of that sentence. Claire picked up the tray again. My brother is healthy now. Richard looked at her. Then why never go back? Claire glanced toward the dining room she had worked in for 6 years. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped measuring success the same way everyone else does. The answer settled over the room like quiet rain. No drama. No grand revelation. Just truth. And for the first time that night, Richard understood that the most remarkable thing about Claire Whitmore was not the languages she spoke, it was everything she had willingly given up for someone she loved. Richard stood quietly for several seconds after Claire disappeared into the kitchen. The restaurant was nearly empty now. The lights had dimmed. The rain had stopped. Beyond the windows, Chicago shimmered beneath the midnight sky. Somewhere in the distance, traffic moved through wet streets reflecting gold and silver light. Yet Richard barely noticed any of it. He had arrived that evening expecting another successful negotiation. Another contract. Another victory. Instead, he was leaving with something far more valuable. Perspective. 20 minutes later, Claire stepped out through the employee entrance carrying a simple canvas bag over her shoulder. The night air was cool. Fresh. Peaceful. She was surprised to find Richard waiting near the curb. Not in his car. Not surrounded by assistants. Just standing there alone. You are still here, she said. Richard smiled. Apparently I am. Claire laughed softly. The sound carried easily through the quiet street. Richard reached into his coat pocket and removed a business card. Then another. The second one was blank except for a private number written in dark ink. I would like to offer you a position. Claire looked at the card but did not take it. I suspected you might. Richard nodded. The salary would be substantial. The opportunities would be unlimited. Claire smiled knowingly. And there it is. Richard paused. Then he surprised himself. Slowly, he lowered the card. Actually, that is not why I stayed. Claire raised an eyebrow. Richard looked down the street before speaking again. When I walked into that restaurant tonight, I thought success was something you measured with numbers. His voice was calm. Honest. Revenue. Assets. Contracts. Market value. Claire listened quietly. Then I met someone who walked away from a brilliant career to help her family. Someone who could have spent years chasing recognition but chose something else. The city seemed unusually still around them. Richard extended the card one final time. Keep this if you ever need anything. Not because I think you need saving. Claire accepted the card. Then why? Richard smiled. A genuine smile this time. Because remarkable people should know they have allies. For a moment neither spoke. Then Claire slipped the card into her bag. Thank you. Richard nodded and walked toward the waiting town car. Halfway there, he stopped and turned back. By the way. Claire looked up. What was the sentence you answered earlier? A small smile appeared on her face. The same smile that had puzzled him all evening. The one in Arabic? Yes. Claire folded her arms lightly. You really want to know? Richard laughed. I think I earned that much. Claire looked toward the city lights. Then back at him. You joked that nobody carrying a coffee pot could possibly understand the conversation. Richard froze. Not from embarrassment this time. From realization. Claire continued gently. My reply was simple. She smiled. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room. Richard stood there for a second. Then another. Finally he laughed harder than he had in years. Claire waved and started walking toward the train station. No spotlight followed her. No audience applauded. No headlines announced her departure. Yet. Somehow she left carrying the one thing money could never guarantee, dignity. And as Richard watched her disappear into the night, he understood a lesson that would stay with him long after every contract from that evening was forgotten. The most extraordinary people often arrive disguised as ordinary ones.